Okay, so for the first slide, looking at we're going to talk about modern American landscapes, but the background for this slide is actually wallpaper that's designed by the first artist that we're going to talk about, by Charles Birchfield. So Charles Birchfield had a studio practice where he would work on paintings and artworks that fed his own creativity that he did for himself. But then he also supported himself and his family by doing commercial design work. And so there's some crossover, like some neat design elements that that you can see from his paintings and the wallpaper as well. So the first painting that we're going to look at is by Charles Birchfield, and it's called Dandelion Seed Heads and the Moon. Okay, so I think I was recording still. So for the first painting, Charles Birchfield is a modernist, and so the group that we're looking at right now is modernist painters or artists. And modern art starts around the Industrial Revolution, and it's a reaction mostly to photography and film. Right, so photography is a way to capture reality in a very realistic way, and then film is a way to capture motion and different scenes from multiple angles. Right, you have that option to move around. So
and it's true to life.
Right, and Cubist art was sort of the beginning, sort of Impressionist Cubist art. Those artists were interested in trying to capture an image from multiple angles, like you would with film, but in one painting. So it resulted in these kind of deconstructed, what we think of now as, Cubist abstract paintings or collages, things like that. And so Charles Birchfield, this painting was made in 61 to 65, but he was mostly working in the 30s and 40s, still making work like this. So I tend to think of him as an earlier modernist painter. What's interesting about his work is that you can see that he's looking at some details from life in the shapes of the dandelions, the way that the dandelions are layered, so it looks like some are progressing further in the background. You can see some nice details in the dragonfly itself, but the images are more abstract because he's sort of exaggerating pattern and all these reverberating lines around the light of the moon and the dragonflies. He was really trying to capture a sense of rhythm or sound or heat.
Yeah, it's kind of like ripples in a lake or something like that, like sound waves or heat waves.
Right, exactly. So he's really interested in trying to capture not only the what it felt like to be in that landscape, but also other sensory issues like sound and heat. And so often he would have sort of parts of his landscape would be undulating or reverberating to show that. The next artist that we were going to look at is Georgia O'Keeffe, and Georgia O'Keeffe is fairly well known. A lot of her flower works from later in her career, and also the images that she made in the Southwest of skulls and things like that are more well known. But her early works are really interesting as well. And in this image, New York with Moon, Georgia O'Keeffe she's playing with composition and sort of simplifying parts of it, but then exaggerating other parts. So it's abstract, but there's enough real elements and observed shapes and lines that you know what it is that she's saying pretty clearly. So like if you look in the distance right down here, I know it's hard to see,
yeah,
but
or a church steeple.
A church steeple, and there's just enough small detail that we know that that's true. In the buildings, there's not necessarily windows and doors, but the way that she's paid attention to two-point perspective and showing linear perspective makes it believable, right?
Wow, she lived to a ripe old age.
Yeah, she lived for a long time. And then
Sorry.
another, oh, it's okay, a repeating motif in this image is light sources. So we can see that there are three different ways that she's interpreting light. The street lamp um, is kind of the main event because of the way that it's showing these halos around it,
Draws
and
the
it's
eye.
close to the center. But the title is New York with Moon, so she really is also interested in this slice of sky that looks like it's slashed through the buildings to show the moon reflecting on the clouds. And then also the third light is the street light
Yeah.
or the stop signal. So she's playing with this repeating motif, um, and she's really interested in
And maybe a little bit of
shifts.
the dawn in the lower corner.
Yeah, so there might be some dawn or dusk in the lower corner on the left, but she's really using shifts in value, light to dark, and between colors throughout as well. I had you guys watch the video on Georgia O'Keeffe's The Lawrence Tree, and
I don't think I saw that. When was that? Was this yesterday that you showed the video?
no, it was homework for over the weekend, so you can watch it. It's like a 2 or 3 minute video,
Okay. Yeah.
and it's up on the website. So this image, she's also playing with sort of an exaggerated perspective of the viewer, right? So if you look, she said that this painting could be hung in any orientation and still work, right? So that tree could be sort of hung in any orientation, and she's exaggerating the perspective of laying beneath the tree and looking up at the tree and experiencing the landscape, not in the typical sort of horizon line perspective that we're used to seeing.
Taking the camera and flipping it around.
Yeah, and it creates sort of an intimate connection between the viewer and the artist because you really feel like you're in her shoes. I mean, either looking up and being in experiencing the sky and the image that we just looked at of New York with the moon.
It's more personal.
Yeah, it's more personal, exactly. It's how you might actually experience these landscapes. Not that you wouldn't look at them straight on too, but it's just a more personal connection, and it's meant to sort of shake up the perspective. The next artist is Arthur Dove, and Arthur Dove is often compared to Georgia O'Keeffe. They're often mentioned together, and sometimes now that they're both gone, museums will show both of their works together because there's a lot of crossover. Arthur Dove is also interested in sort of simplifying and using rhythm or sort of this variations in tone in his work, going from light to dark. He also has this sort of radiating shape of red that you can see in this painting that's called Ferry Boat Wreck. And so the red, if you look, it has little notches on the outside, and a ferry boat is typically a boat that would be on a river, right? Going from side to side or transporting people, not long distances. So somebody in one of the previous classes said that they saw that red circle as possibly the big wheel that moves the water.
Yeah. Oh,
right?
no, I see what you mean now. I was looking at notches into the red color, but I see that it looks kind of like a gear.
Yeah.
Just a little cubes on the side. So yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah, and
Very abstract.
some people saw it as being underwater, and some people saw the undulating lines in the background as land receding, and that the ripples at the bottom of the painting were the shoreline. So lots of people read it different ways. There's definitely parts that are kind of lodged onto other parts or trees or something, and so his work is open to a lot of interpretations. Different people create different narratives for what they're seeing, and you might interpret the shapes that are much more simplified in different ways. And I think but that's true across all of his work. Okay, I worked at a gallery where we handled his work often, and I've looked at lots of images by him, and even with that experience, I might be able to see things
In a new
more
way each
regularly. But and he does have repetition, so it's like when you're reading a book by a certain author that might be hard to get into. The more practice you have listening to their voice and the way that they lay out a story, you know, the more likely you are to understand it. Same thing with his work, but even with that, there are some paintings where you're like, what is he doing here, right? Like, but he's playful and he's sort of playing with like, what is it that I can, what is it that I can simplify, and what is it that needs to be more accessible
Yeah.
to leave these open narratives. Aaron Douglas is another artist that I wanted to mention to you guys. So
Do we
during
need to memorize all of these paintings, or do you have a set of them that we're looking at?
I want you guys to, you're responsible for all of these. Yeah.
Okay.
Just so you can refer to them. I'm more interested in you being able to talk about their meaning and.
So like like in the past, probably memorize good details of like name and date and painter for like 3 or 4 of them, and then really
I'm
focus.
more interested in the name of the artist
Okay.
than titles, because you can always describe the image. If you know the image, you can always say that the artist and then the image, right? And then date. Date is good to know, but for our purposes, I don't think it's the most important thing. I would like you guys to try to memorize them, because as you move towards college, I think it's good if you're going to refer to something
To know the date.
to know, just to know information about it, instead of referring to something and saying the guy who painted the thing, so getting used to being responsible for that kind of information. I think total it's about 30 images or 30 works that I want you guys to know.
Okay.
Like total, it's not that much. There's the most in this one.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
So
when will the test for this be? Next week?
Monday.
Okay.
Yeah. So Aaron Douglas, he was an artist that was working during the Harlem Renaissance. So Renaissance is a word that we know from the Italian Renaissance. It means that it's a
Rebirth.
rebirth, exactly, a period of time where there's a lot of innovation and creation in terms of academics, so science, literature, mathematics, art,
All aspects
music.
of society.
Right. So anything that's sort of cultural or academic, there's a lot of growth happening. So if we were to think of the Harlem Renaissance, Harlem is a neighborhood in Manhattan that's primarily African American during this time, and also now, I would say it still is.
Yeah.
And so the Harlem Renaissance during this period of time, during 1936. What's really interesting is that basically segregation is still happening, right? This is before Martin Luther King and the March on Washington, right? But this is a primarily black neighborhood where that means that African American culture can not only be celebrated but thrive and be innovated,
Right.
right? So the birth of jazz and
I remember talking about this
poetry.
in Spanish.
Uh-huh.
I think it was Spanish. Might have been English, but talking about how the Harlem Renaissance and music that was created. I think music is focused on a lot, especially with the creation of jazz.
Yeah, and also writing and theory. And so if we can think of being able to celebrate Black culture, this is a precursor to the civil rights movement, right? It's important for this to happen, for later events to happen. So Aaron Douglas, if we look at this image, in the foreground, in the bottom of the painting, there are these sort of simplified hands
With
chains, right? And then in the middle ground, we have some simplified bodies. They almost have like an Egyptian quality. They're strong, simplified bodies that
the
are
heads
looking,
tilted to the side.
yeah, that are looking up to the background where we can see this landscape. But in the middle ground, they're looking forward and pointing forward, but they're empowered by holding. It looks like a chemistry flask. Um, there's a globe and sort of measurement tools and books. So they're looking towards a future. The title is called Aspiration, and so we're thinking about aspiration and folks looking for equality, and also
Better life.
a better life through academics and sort of access to education and things like that. And then also, if we look, there's aesthetically, aside from what's going on in the image, in the landscape, we can see that there is a star.
It's kind of like Captain
that's
America's shield.
right, but the star is this repeating shape that radiates, and wherever it crosses over, there's not lines, but there's a slight shift in value. So he's playing with design and having two images layered over each other. Okay, and it's there are abstract elements to this, but it's a really interesting take on color theory and an important part of the Harlem Renaissance. And what's cool about modernism and art that's being made in the 1900s or 20th century is that there are lots of different ways people are interpreting modern art, right? And people have access to knowing about different traditions in art, and they're reinventing according to their own needs. So the next image, Joan Mitchell, she's an abstract expressionist, and basically she's making work much earlier than this. So this painting was made in 1979, but a lot of her work was being made in the 50s and 60s. And she came right after Pollock. So Jackson Pollock, who did the drip paintings, right? Where you're using both, any abstract expressionist artist is using the gesture of the artist. So you would be able to see arm movements and evidence that the artist was using their full body to make these strokes, right? Joan Mitchell talked about making landscapes from, or just paintings in general, landscapes or still lifes or any images that she was making from memory. So she's trying to capture the essence of that memory. So maybe different tones she's using, strokes she's using, and even though these are 4 different panels, there's some connections between the 4 panels. Her work can sometimes, some folks have said in class, like, oh, I could do that, or, something to keep in mind is that
Sort of classic Pollock things to say.
Artists who are working in this way, it's not that they don't have the skill to make realistic images, but because they're choosing not to, there's a rebellion happening. They're aware, they're skillful, but they're re-exploring painting, because if film can create realistic images that are showing more information than paintings, if photographs can capture more detail in the moment,
why be detailed?
Why paint? Why paint, right? So all of these different artists are kind of reacting to like an existential crisis, right?
Finding a new
Like,
niche.
right. Every once in a while, somebody even now is going to say, "Well, painting is dead," right? Unless you find a purpose for doing it. And sometimes art makes more sense in the context of the time that it was made, right? So this is a rebellion. She's married to somebody who's involved in the beat poetry scene and sort of like being more avant-garde, and in New York during the time when the United States had just come out of World War II victoriously, right? So abstract expressionist art is kind of when the center of the art world moves to New York. So we look at this and it's like, it might be hard to sort of think about that as being an important landmark, but it's like, it's a very American, almost austere or arrogant way of saying, like, we, we're exploring different ways of painting and really putting the artist at the center, right? Literally the gestures of the artist and the artist process is really being celebrated, and it's outrageous, which I think people are always looking for something to shock about.
Yeah.
But would this be as outrageous if it was made now? Maybe not, right? It has its place in time. They are still beautiful to look at. Like these images don't do them justice. This is huge,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And to experience and be able to see.
I mean, knowing Pollock's stuff, he would just take like a little board and do some stuff. He took giant walls, basically.
Yeah, and it's like there is a closeness that you feel to the artist, thinking about the layers that she built up and the different colors that she was working with. Helen Frankenthaler, this first image, if we look at this, the image is showing sort of an abstract expressionist.
We're gonna do red light, yellow light, green light.
So in this image, it's more of a sketch, and I showed two images of her work, and we can actually see them next to each other here. But so Mountains and Sea is more of a sketch. It's kind of more connected to what Joan Mitchell was doing.
Sort of super abstract.
Yeah, it's very abstract. And I wanted to just show it to show progression in her work, because if we look at the next one, The Bay, we can see that this is made during the 60s, about 10 years later than that first one. And it's still very abstract, but if we think of a bay, you can almost see the outlines or the inlets.
So like
to
the
a
name
bay.
helps bring it meaning.
Yeah,
The name
absolutely.
plays a big role.
The title is important. But you can see these little inlets. So she's showing control over the paint and how to use control and lack of control. So
Controlled chaos almost.
right. So inside this shape, the color is bleeding, and she might be controlling that and have experience enough, but she's letting the paint take over in some areas. But then in other areas, she's very clear about the lines and shapes that she wants to make, especially on the edges. So if we think about the 60s and this work, this is sort of more minimal abstraction, right? And there's more very minimal sculpture happening at this time. If we think about fashion and mod fashion, you can think of like girls that would be wearing like almost a like one basic shape dress,
Yeah.
where it comes in at the shoulders and then bells out at the bottom, and it's like not form fitting, right? It's just one solid color or a pattern and a blocky shape. We can also think of architecture at this time.
Yeah, like the what's his face? Lloyd Wright?
That's
Maybe
a little
that
early.
might be a little early.
That's earlier, but thinking about like the 50s and 60s, I think of like very clean, minimal
Square houses.
buildings. Yeah.
The one-story house.
So
with the chimney.
yeah. So the point to minimalism is how can I convey an idea? Really, less is more. So how can I get at the essence of a painting by playing with this play between control and lack of control? The title is important. So articulating something with just the essence of it. The next image I wanted to show you guys was Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty.
Is that a
And
painting or a photo?
it's a photograph, and it's not. So he's not making an image of a landscape. He's actually making art with the landscape. So, so he was making work before Andy Goldsworthy was. I believe Andy Goldsworthy is probably younger and was maybe working 10, 15, 20 years later. But there's crossover there, right? They're both installation pieces where they're
I
using
remember
nature.
Goldsworthy from Div 1.
Yeah, of course. And so so photographing the work is really important. And this actually still exists. So it's in the Great Salt Lake in Utah, and maintaining it is a challenge. But they get funds from different art councils, and I think that it's a tourist attraction. The tides go in and go out, but he was, again, modernism is this umbrella where lots of people are trying lots of different ways of interpreting the tradition of landscape at this point, and so this is one person's take on it. And there are other people doing artworks as well. So like Christo and Jean Claude are wrapping buildings in giant
And islands.
swaths of fabric and islands, exactly. So the next image, Jeff Wall, is a photographer, and he is showing a scene, sort of a private scene inside an apartment. It's called A View from an Apartment, and framed in the window, you can see an outside shot of Vancouver. So if we think back to how other landscape artists we've looked at are exploring the connection between man and nature, right? This is very much through the lens of an everyday scene in this apartment. And then there's a vista that's almost, it looks, some people thought it was a painting or a photograph hanging on the wall, but it's actually a window to the outside. So I would still consider this a landscape image. It's just looking at it through a very different foreground. Something that's also interesting about this artist is he used a large format camera like Ansel Adams to capture a lot of fine detail. This is printed on a light box, so it's backlit and it's printed on a piece of plexiglass, so it actually looks like it's glowing in person. And then another interesting tidbit is that okay, so in this image, you can see that these women are at home. What's interesting though is that Jeff Wall actually rented this apartment for them and gave them money to furnish it. Probably he was aware of the scene that was outside. But how does that change the way that we look at the image? Right? Is it more contrived in some ways?
He set it up. He set up the conditions and sort of let it flow, I guess you could say.
Right, and I don't think he was controlling all aspects. I mean,
No,
I think they were
I
actually
doubt it.
living there, but
He created a set of circumstances and let the circumstances continue, and then sort of checked in and said, "Oh, cool, take a picture."
right, and it makes me think about the time that he's making it. This is 2004, 2005. Um, reality TV has already been something that happened. So that performance part of his piece, where he's setting up these conditions, is actually something that's happening, right? We are fascinated as a culture with people sharing their own realities, whether it's through social media or TV or things like that. And then the next image is Gregory Crutzen that we looked at in drawing class. And in this image, he's a photographer. He's using.
He's got a giant camera, and he doesn't actually snap the photo. He just sets everything up.
Right. He's heavily influenced by film and sort of creating mystic, everyday situations. He's also aware of, like if we think about romantic landscape paintings or film sets and the way that light is used to sort of draw attention and create mystery.
He does a lot of that.
He does a lot of that.
Lights and
yeah.
crazy giant sets.
So we started talking about modernism by people who are interested in rebelling against film. He's now been studying film. Film's been around for a long time at this point, right? And so he's now we're starting to get into almost postmodernism, right, where people are reappropriating aspects of culture and incorporating them into their own. So this could be a film still that he's creating here. Wayne White is the next artist that we're going to look at, and basically he's working with kitsch or high and low art. Right, he has very strong art skills. He has an interesting sense of humor, and he's a little bit snarky. He worked as a designer on Pee-wee's Playhouse for sets and also puppets. And so he has sort of a childlike sensibility sometimes in his work. But if we look at this painting, Honest Artists, he found this painting. The landscape and the frame are sort of kitsch or like a mass-produced cultural icon. So everybody has seen this kind of like 70s throwback landscape in either a relative's living room or at a yard sale or something like that. And other examples of kitsch are like things like a gnome for your front yard. They're sort of like tacky. Um,
Coke, honestly, at this point.
yeah, maybe, or Coke memorabilia.
Yeah.
It might be sort of kitschy.
Yeah.
Things that are kind of over the top and a little gaudy. Thinking about like the cat clock,
Yeah.
with its eyes go back and forth and the tail wags. So he found the painting and then he integrated text, right? So he integrated the words honest artist as these three-dimensional objects that are in the landscape. And he works to make sure that the light that hits the text matches on the
So
words.
he kind of integrates it as if it was originally part of the
Right.
painting.
So and he'll paint over some of the original painting, like in the reflection of the water, you can see the word being reflected. So he's really working to integrate to create new meaning. Okay. And then another example of his work is fast food. So in this one, he's not using text, but instead he's integrating this building that is sort of a generic fusion of any fast food place that you've seen, right? The color and the architecture. There's air conditioner over the door. It's just very industrial looking. It's got the windows that you would see next to the booth by the window. Still, it's a little bit of vintage throwback to fast food, but he might be making a social commentary on sort of the vast landscape and then the vast culture of fast food, or how pervasive it is. But also, if you look and see, like the waves are undulating against the side of the building, so he really works to make sure, like you said before, that
It integrates seamlessly.
yeah, exactly. So that it really feels like these elements could coexist. So there's even a reflection in the water of the yellow from the building.
That's quite
Right.
impressive.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And then the last image I wanted to look at, this is by David Hockney, and I don't know the exact date, but it was probably made in the past couple of years. And his work is really cool. He is probably the most famous living British artist, but he also is considered a California artist because he does portraiture and landscapes in both places almost equally. I think he
Weird.
yeah. So I wanted to show this image because at this point, he's been making famous work since like the 60s. He's probably in his early 80s, late 70s at this point. And I think it's so cool that he's using an iPad to make these later works. He still uses traditional art materials to make his work, but he's a classically trained painter, and he's using techniques like atmospheric perspective still. He's still finding textures, blending, textures layering, and using this new tool to have more access. I mean, I think he still works outside with his paint and probably has like assistants and things, but think about how much more mobile and accessible it is for an older gentleman to go out into the woods with an iPad instead
An
of
infinite amount of slides and ink and whatever you want. As
Right.
long as you
I mean,
have lots of battery.
it's not that he can't afford for the help to get that stuff out there, but I just think it's so cool that all of his painting skills translate so well over to this tool. as
And
well.
maybe some of the solidarity or the solitude is important for his process.
Yeah. I mean, having access to the iPad, being self-reliant.
Yourself.
Yeah. And then he prints these on really large, like foam core or paper, things like that, so you can display them, not just digitally, but. And what's neat is that I went to an exhibition of his work, and they also had, because he was working digitally, he had a lot of time lapse videos of how he built up his images too, which is
Neat.
pretty cool.
Yeah.
So that's it.
All right.